The courthouse stood like a fortress in the heart of the city, its tall stone columns casting long shadows across the crowded steps. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing as officers guided witnesses and attorneys through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was charged with an unusual intensity. This was no ordinary trial. The defendant sitting in the dock had been accused of crimes so disturbing that the entire community had been shaken. People wanted justice, yet few believed the case would take the turn it soon would. The courtroom itself mirrored the mood. Dark wooden panels lined the walls, their polished surface reflecting the glow of overhead lamps. The jurors sat stiffly, already weary despite the trial barely beginning. The judge, a stern man with years of experience behind the bench, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the room. He had presided over countless cases, from petty thefts to high-profile murders. Yet something about this one carried a heavier weight. Even he could feel it pressing on his chest at the front. Near the witness stand, a large German shepherd lay at attention. Ranger, the police K9, looked out of place to some. A few whispered why a dog had been allowed inside the courtroom. Most assumed he was there merely for security, a silent guardian to discourage any disruption. His handler, Officer Hayes, stood close by, one hand resting on the leash. Hayes knew Ranger wasn't just a deterrent. A dog had been instrumental in the arrest of the man now on trial. He had tracked, cornered, and helped bring him into custody. To Hayes, Ranger wasn't simply a K9, he was a partner, a brother, and in many ways, the heart of the department. Ranger's amber eyes swept the room with an alertness only dogs possess. His ears twitched at every shuffle of papers, every cough. From the gallery. Yet his posture remained calm, his tail curled neatly by his side. He wasn't restless. He was waiting, watching. Readied out at the back of the gallery, a young woman sat quietly, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Beside her, a small girl leaned against her arm, clutching a worn teddy bear with one hand and chewing nervously on her sleeve with the other. The woman's eyes darted nervously around the room. She had avoided courtrooms all her life, never imagining she would one day be sitting in one with her daughter. She knew the importance of this trial, yet she also knew the toll it had already taken on her child. The little girl, no more than 3 years old, seemed fragile compared to the heavy seriousness around her. The wooden benches towered over her small frame, and the whispers in the room seemed like thunder in her ears. She tucked herself closer to her mother, peeking cautiously toward the front where the defendant sat. The sight of him made her eyes widen, her grip on her teddy tightening until the stitches seemed ready to burst. The defendant, a man in his late 30s with dark hair slicked back, leaned casually in his seat. His lips curled into a faint smirk, as if he were amused by the entire proceeding. Dressed in a crisp suit, he might have looked like any businessman had it not been for the coldness in his eyes. Those who had followed the case knew that smirk, well, it had haunted police interviews and court hearings. To the community, it was the face of someone who believed he was untouchable. But beneath his confidence lay tension. He shifted slightly when his gaze flicked to the girl in the gallery. For just a second, the smirk faltered. His jaw tightened before he forced the expression back, leaning toward his lawyer as though nothing had happened. The judge's gavel struck the sound block with a sharp crack, commanding silence. "This court is now in session," he declared, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "The People versus Daniel Cross." A ripple of murmurs traveled through the crowd before dying down. Everyone knew his name. It had been printed on newspapers, whispered in coffee shops, debated in homes. This trial wasn't just about one man's guilt or innocence. It had become a symbol of justice itself. The prosecutor, a tall woman with sharp features and unwavering determination in her eyes, rose to address the court. She began by outlining the charges, her words crisp and deliberate. The room hung on every syllable, the gravity of the case settling deeper with each count read aloud. The jurors shifted in their seats, some visibly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Ranger's gaze moved once more toward the little girl. His ears perked slightly as she fidgeted, her teddy bear pressed to her chest. Almost instinctively, his tail gave a faint thump against the floor, a silent reassurance. No one else noticed, but the girl did. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she stopped chewing her sleeve and allowed her shoulders to relax, just a little. Officer Hayes glanced down at his partner, recognizing the subtle gesture. Ranger had always been good with children. It was one of those qualities that couldn't be trained, only born. Hayes made no move to stop him. Sometimes, even in the most formal settings, a dog knew what people needed better than anyone else. The defense attorney rose, his voice slick with confidence, as he objected to the tone of the prosecution's introduction. He strutted across the courtroom like an actor on stage, smiling at the jury, casting doubt with every carefully chosen word. To him, this was just another performance, another case to win. He thrived on dismantling the credibility of witnesses, exploiting technicalities, twisting details until they lost their meaning. Yet for all his theatrics, the jurors weren't entirely convinced. Some glanced toward the gallery, where the mother and child sat quietly. They hadn't been introduced yet, but their presence lingered in everyone's awareness, like an unsolved riddle waiting to reveal itself. The judge eventually called for the first witness, and the trial began in earnest. Testimonies were given, evidence presented, objections raised. Hours passed, yet the undercurrent of tension never left. Every time the child shifted on the bench, people's eyes drifted toward her, though no one dared speak. Something about her presence felt inevitable, as though she were more than just a spectator. And through it all, Ranger waited. His head rested lightly on his paws, but his eyes never closed. Every so often, his gaze returned to the little girl, his tail offering the smallest of movements. Like a signal only she could understand. By late afternoon, fatigue set in. The courtroom grew stuffy, the air thick with anticipation. The judge called a brief recess, and people rose from their seats, stretching and murmuring among themselves. The little girl leaned closer to her mother, whispering something no one else could hear. Her mother hushed her gently, smoothing her hair with trembling hands. Unnoticed by most, Ranger's ears twitched at the sound. He gave a soft, almost imperceptible whine, as though acknowledging her words. Officer Hayes looked down, puzzled but saying nothing. He had long since learned that when Ranger reacted, it was never without reason. The recess ended, and the gavel struck once more. The trial resumed. The tension that had momentarily lifted returned with greater force. Something was coming, everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The mother straightened, her face pale but resolute. The little girl clung to her teddy, her wide eyes darting once again toward the man at the front. For a brief second, their gazes locked. The smirk disappeared entirely this time. The girl's lip trembled, but she didn't hide. She simply gripped her teddy tighter and pressed closer to her mother. In that moment, an unspoken truth filled the courtroom. This child wasn't just another face in the gallery. She was going to matter. She was going to speak. And when she did, her words would carry more weight than anyone could imagine. And Ranger, ever watchful, seemed to know it too. His steady gaze never wavered, his posture tense with quiet anticipation. He was waiting for his moment, not as a guard dog, not as evidence, but as something far greater. The trial was only beginning, but already the air was thick with the sense that history was about to be written within those walls. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shafts of light across the polished wooden floor. Dust floated lazily in the air, glowing like tiny stars in the otherwise heavy atmosphere. The hum of whispered voices had barely settled when the prosecutor stood abruptly, her dark suit pressed sharp against her frame. She glanced briefly at the jurors, then at the judge, and finally toward the gallery. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm yet firm. "The prosecution would like to call its next witness." The defense attorney, a man who carried arrogance like a second skin, leaned back in his chair with a faint chuckle. He whispered something to his client, who smirked in return. The idea that the state could have another powerful witness seemed laughable to them. They had spent weeks dismantling testimony after testimony, twisting every account into something unreliable. To them, another witness was just another piece of fabric to tear apart. But when the prosecutor's eyes turned toward the gallery, the entire courtroom shifted uneasily. "The people call Emily Parker," she said softly. A ripple of murmurs passed through the benches. Heads turned. At the back, the young woman with trembling hands froze. Her breath caught in her throat as all eyes fell on her. She looked down quickly, brushing her daughter's hair nervously. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Parker, is the witness ready?" The woman's lips trembled. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. Then came the words that silenced the courtroom completely. "The witness," the prosecutor clarified, "is her daughter." Gasps filled the air. The little girl, clutching her teddy bear so tightly its button eye was nearly loose, looked up in confusion. She wasn't old enough to understand the magnitude of what had just been said. All she knew was that suddenly, everyone was staring at her. The defense attorney shot up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "This is outrageous. She's a child, barely 3 years old. She cannot be called as a competent witness." The judge adjusted his glasses and fixed his stern gaze on the prosecutor. "Counselor, is this your strategy? To parade a toddler in front of the jury?" But the prosecutor didn't flinch. "Your Honor, while her age is undeniable, the court is aware of the circumstances. The child was present during the incident. She is the only living witness who can directly identify the defendant." The murmurs grew louder now, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked sympathetic toward the little girl. Others doubted. What could a toddler possibly contribute? Surely she was too young to understand truth from imagination. The defense attorney smirked, sensing advantage. "Your Honor, this is a circus. The child cannot even construct a full sentence, let alone withstand cross-examination. This is a ploy to sway the jury with emotion, nothing more." The judge considered, his hand poised above the bench, as though he might strike his gavel to end the debate. But then his eyes flickered toward the child. She sat silently, her legs swinging. Just short of the floor, her teddy clutched against her chest. She was small, yes, innocent, but in her wide eyes, there was something deeper await, a memory that no child should carry. The judge exhaled slowly. "I will allow it," he said at last. "But the testimony will proceed under strict observation. One inappropriate question, and I will intervene." The defense attorney groaned audibly, throwing himself back into his chair. The prosecutor nodded, calm but resolute. The bailiff moved to guide the little girl forward. She hesitated at first, her mother whispering soothing words as she urged her along. The courtroom, normally restless with coughs and shifting bodies, grew utterly still. All anyone could hear was the soft shuffle of her tiny shoes against the wooden floor as she made her way to the witness stand. Ranger, the police canine, lifted his head. His ears perked as he followed the girl's movement with quiet intensity. His handler, Officer Hayes, felt the leash tighten faintly in his hand. Ranger wasn't anxious. but alert, keenly aware of the child's every step. The girl climbed onto the stand with help from the bailiff, her small frame nearly swallowed by the large wooden chair. The judge peered down at her, his stern expression softening despite himself. "What is your name, sweetheart?" he asked gently. The little girl blinked and whispered, "Lily." Her voice was barely audible. The judge nodded. "And how old are you, Lily?" She held up 3 fingers, her teddy clutched tightly in her other hand. A quiet murmur of sympathy ran through the gallery. The prosecutor approached slowly, careful not to intimidate. She knelt so her eyes were level with Lily's. "Hi, Lily," she said softly. "Do you remember me?" Lily nodded, pressing her face briefly against her teddy. "I'm just going to ask you a few questions, okay? And if you get scared, you can take your time." The child didn't answer, but her silence spoke louder than words. She was listening. She was trying. The defense attorney leaned toward the jury, shaking his head in disbelief, as though to remind them of the absurdity. But no one looked at him. Their eyes were fixed on the tiny figure in the witness stand. "Lily," the prosecutor continued gently, "do you know why you're here today?" The little girl glanced toward the front of the courtroom. Her eyes landed on the defendant, and instantly her body tensed. She pulled the teddy bear closer, shrinking into the chair. The room seemed to freeze. Even the defendant's smirk faltered as their eyes met. "I don't think this is wise," the defense attorney muttered loudly. But before anyone could speak, something remarkable happened. Lily's eyes darted away from the man and landed on Ranger. The German shepherd was watching her intently, his body still, his eyes soft. Almost instinctively, she reached her small hand out, as if she wanted him near. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Officer Hayes, bring the dog closer." The handler hesitated only a moment before guiding Ranger toward the witness stand. The dog padded forward silently, his nails clicking softly on the floor. He sat at Lily's side, his massive frame a fortress of safety. Without hesitation, Lily slid off the chair and wrapped her tiny arms around his neck. The gallery gasped. Even the prosecutor froze at the sight. Ranger lowered his head slightly, allowing her to bury her face into his fur. A soft whine escaped him, as though he understood her fear and was telling her she wasn't alone. The judge's stern mask cracked. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes betraying something rarely seen in court: compassion. The prosecutor swallowed hard, then tried again. "Lily, do you feel safe with Ranger here?" The girl nodded without hesitation. The defense attorney groaned, but his voice carried little weight now. The jury was captivated, not by theatrics, but by the raw, unfiltered honesty of a child. Finding courage, the prosecutor's next words carried carefully measured weight. "Lily, do you remember what happened the night the police came?" The child didn't speak. Not yet. She clung to Ranger, her little chest rising and falling rapidly. Against his fur, the prosecutor waited patiently, the silence stretching unbearably long. Even the judge didn't interrupt. Finally, Lily's small lips parted. Her voice was faint, trembling, but audible enough for the courtroom to hear. "I saw him." Her finger twitched slightly, pointing toward the defendant. The smirk vanished completely from his face. The gallery erupted into stunned whispers, cut off only by the gavel slamming down. Order was demanded. Silence returned. And though the testimony had only just begun, everyone in that courtroom felt it. This was no longer just another trial. This was the turning point. A 3-year-old girl had spoken, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence inside the courtroom was thick enough to feel. Every juror leaned forward, straining to catch the child's faint words. The little girl Lily had said, "I saw him," and pointed timidly toward the defendant. It was more than anyone expected from a child so young. But the weight of those words seemed to exhaust her. She trembled, clutching Ranger, the German Shepherd Police K9. As though he was the only safe thing in the world, the judge cleared his throat, but even his usually booming voice softened. Let the record reflect the child has identified the defendant. We'll proceed carefully. The prosecutor gave Lily a small smile. You're very brave, sweetheart. Do you want Ranger to stay with you? Lily's tiny head nodded quickly, curls bouncing. She pressed her cheek into the thick fur at Ranger's neck. The jury couldn't help but notice how her whole body seemed to relax in his presence. She wasn't just holding him, she was anchored to him, as if without Ranger, she might drift away into fear. Ranger sat perfectly still, as though he understood the gravity of his role. His handler, Officer Hayes, gave him no command. He didn't need to. Ranger seemed to know, instinctively, that this was his duty, not to apprehend criminals, but to protect this trembling child's heart. The defense attorney stood abruptly, his chair scraping. Your Honor, this is absurd. The witness is clearly too frightened, and now the dog has become part of her testimony? Are we really going to allow an animal to influence a jury like this? The judge's sharp eyes cut across the room. Sit down, counselor. The dog is not influencing anyone. He is providing comfort, which this child clearly needs. Unless you'd like to argue she testify in fear and silence? The defense attorney hesitated, his lips pressed thin, then sank reluctantly. Back into his chair, Lily peeked up from Ranger's fur, her gaze flicking nervously between the prosecutor and the dog. Her fingers gripped his collar like she might lose him if she let go. The prosecutor crouched down, careful to keep her tone gentle. Lily, do you remember what Ranger did when the police came that night? The girl's lips moved silently before. She found the courage to whisper. He barked. Loud, then he found me. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and his tail gave a slow thump against the polished wooden floor. The gallery murmured, touched by the innocence of her testimony. To the jurors, it was becoming clear. This wasn't manipulation. This was a bond. A child had found her protector in a dog, and through him, she could finally speak. The prosecutor leaned slightly closer. Did Ranger help you feel safe that night? Lily's tiny hand stroked his fur as if to answer. Safe, she repeated softly. It was a single word, but in that moment, it carried as much power as any long-winded testimony could. The defense attorney leapt to his feet again. Objection, Your Honor. The child's words are being led directly by counsel. The judge raised an unimpressed brow. Overruled. The child's responses are her own, however brief. I will remind both parties that brevity does not equal insignificance. The prosecutor nodded gratefully before continuing. She lowered her voice even more, as though sharing a secret with Lily. Do you want to tell us anything else? Or would you like Ranger to stay with you until you're ready? For a moment, Lily seemed lost in thought. She leaned close to Ranger, whispering something into his ear. The dog's ears perked, and he gave another soft whine, shifting slightly so she could hold him tighter. The gallery was transfixed. It was as though Lily and Ranger were speaking their own private language, one no one else could quite hear. The judge leaned forward. Counselor, did she speak? Officer Hayes hesitated before replying. Your Honor, it looked like she whispered. Only to the dog. The defense attorney pounced. Exactly my point. This is meaningless. The jury can't hear what she says unless she directs it to the court. But before anyone could respond, Lily lifted her head. Her eyes, once clouded with fear, now carried a quiet determination. I talked to Ranger first, she explained softly, her voice fragile but clear. Then I can say it? Her words struck like a hammer on steel. Even the most skeptical juror couldn't look away. The innocence of her Explanation rang truer than any lawyer's argument. The prosecutor's throat tightened, but she pressed on gently. That's okay, Lily. You can tell Ranger first if it helps. What do you want to tell him now? The girl turned, cupped her hands around Ranger's ear, and whispered again. This time, after a pause, she lifted her face toward the court. Her lips quivered as she spoke. He hurt Mommy. He's bad. Her tiny finger rose, pointing straight at the defendant. The room froze. The gallery gasped in unison. One juror covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes glistening with tears. The defendant's face hardened, the smirk gone, replaced with a sharp glare. His lawyer grabbed his arm quickly, signaling him to remain calm. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The judge struck the gavel once, not to silence, but to mark the gravity of what had just happened. Let the record reflect, he said gravely. The child has identified the defendant as the one who harmed her mother. The prosecutor swallowed hard, her composure nearly breaking. Thank you, Lily. You've been very brave. The little girl turned back to Ranger, burying her face once more in his fur. She had said her piece. She didn't need to say more. The bond between them had carried her through the fear, giving her words strength she couldn't have found alone. For several moments, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even the defense attorney seemed at a loss, his usual bravado shaken. Finally, the judge called for a recess. The gavel struck again. Court will reconvene in 15 minutes. Chairs scraped as people rose, their voices hushed but urgent. Reporters scribbled frantically. The jurors filed out slowly, still reeling. Meanwhile, Lily remained by Ranger's side. She hadn't moved, hadn't let go. Her mother rushed forward, tears streaming, but careful not to pull her daughter away from the dog. Instead, she knelt beside them, stroking Lily's hair while murmuring, "You did so good, baby. So good." Officer Hayes knelt as well, scratching Ranger gently behind the ears. The dog leaned into the touch, but his eyes never left Lily, as though silently vowing not to leave her until the danger was gone. In the back of the courtroom, the prosecutor stood alone for a moment, watching the scene. She had fought countless battles in her career, but she knew what had just happened was something extraordinary. This wasn't about strategy, or evidence, or clever arguments. This was about truth, the kind of truth that only a child's voice, guided by a loyal dog, could deliver. And though the trial was far from over, everyone inside those walls knew. The tide had shifted. Ranger hadn't just been a police K-9 today. He had been a bridge between silence and courage, between fear and justice. The dog's silent bond had done what no lawyer ever could. The courtroom was unusually still. Moments earlier, the little girl had taken her place at the front, clutching her teddy bear in one arm and resting her free hand in the thick fur of Ranger, the police K-9. Everyone knew this would be the most delicate part of the trial. The child was only 3 years old, barely old enough to string together sentences, much less testify in front of strangers, lawyers, and the man accused of destroying her world. The prosecutor, a calm woman named Ms. Reynolds, stood at a respectful distance. She had practiced this moment countless times in her head. She knew the law didn't require elaborate testimony from the girl, just something honest, something real, something only she could say. But how could anyone expect a child so young to relive such a memory? The judge leaned forward. His gavel sat untouched, his expression softer than usual. "Ms. Reynolds," he said in a low voice, "you may proceed carefully." Ms. Reynolds nodded, stepped forward, and crouched slightly, lowering herself to the child's eye level. "Sweetheart," she began gently, "do you remember me? My name is Sarah. I spoke to you and your mommy before." The girl gave a tiny nod. She didn't speak. Her big eyes darted nervously, toward the defendant sitting across the courtroom. He was trying to keep his face blank, but there was something menacing in his stillness, something the child clearly recognized. She pressed closer against Ranger, burying her face briefly in the dog's neck. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably. The silence dragged. Everyone knew patience was required, but the tension made seconds feel like hours. "Do you know why you're here today?" Ms. Reynolds asked softly. The little girl's lips trembled. She looked toward her mother, who sat only a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. The judge allowed the mother to smile encouragingly, but not speak. The child's breathing grew faster, on the verge of tears, and Ranger moved. The K9, sensing the child's distress, gave a soft, low whine and nuzzled her hand. The girl blinked, loosened her grip on the teddy bear, and whispered something, but only Ranger could hear it. The courtroom leaned forward as if straining to catch her words. But Ms. Reynolds didn't push. She recognized the shift. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said. "You don't have to be afraid. Ranger's right here with you." The girl rubbed her hand against the dog's ear. For the first time, she raised her eyes not toward the defendant, but toward Ms. Reynolds. "Do you remember who Ranger is?" the prosecutor asked. The child gave the smallest of nods. "Can you tell us what he does?" The silence returned. But it wasn't the same suffocating silence from before. This was thoughtful silence, the pause of a child trying to summon courage. Her tiny lips parted. "He helps," she whispered, so soft that the court reporter leaned forward to catch it. Ms. Reynolds smiled warmly. "That's right. Ranger helps people. He helps you, doesn't he?" The girl's hand tightened in the dog's fur. Another nod. The defense attorney, a tall man named Mr. Larkin, rose slowly. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured, "this line of questioning is leading. The child is simply being prompted." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Larkin, the court is fully aware of the sensitivity here. You'll have your chance for cross-examination. Sit down." The defense attorney pursed his lips, but obeyed. Miss Reynolds pressed on carefully. "Sweetheart, when you first saw Ranger, do you remember what happened?" The child hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, her small shoulders lifted in the faintest shrug. "Safe," she whispered, her voice steadier now. The word rang like a bell in the silent courtroom. The jury's eyes widened. The little girl had finally spoken something clear, something from her heart. Ms. Reynolds' own throat tightened, but she kept her composure. "Safe," she repeated gently. "Ranger made you feel safe?" The girl gave a firmer nod. "Yes." The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing toward the jury, as if to underline the significance. The prosecutor's next question hovered in the air like a delicate thread. "Can you tell us what made you feel unsafe?" The child froze again. Her tiny chest rose and fell rapidly. Her eyes darted toward the defendant, who had leaned forward slightly, his jaw clenched. The moment their eyes met, the little girl recoiled, nearly pulling Ranger's fur as she gripped him. Ranger responded instantly. He let out a low growl, not threatening, but protective. The bailiff instinctively stepped forward, but the judge raised his hand, signaling him to stay put. This wasn't aggression. It was loyalty. The girl leaned down, pressing her lips to Ranger's ear. Her voice was too soft for anyone else to hear. The dog sat perfectly still, as though absorbing her secret. A murmur spread through the audience. What was she saying? Was she refusing to speak aloud? Finally, the girl lifted her head. Her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes held a quiet determination. She turned back toward Ms. Reynolds, still holding Ranger close. "Bad," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "Bad man?" Gasps filled the courtroom, though the judge quickly called for order. Ms. Reynolds remained still, not wanting to overwhelm the moment. "You're very brave," she said softly. "Thank you." The defense attorney leapt up again. "Objection. Your Honor, this is a two-word statement from a toddler. It's hardly credible evidence." But the judge didn't strike it from the record. His eyes lingered on the little girl and the dog who gave her strength. The testimony might have been simple, but its weight was undeniable. The jurors exchanged looks. Some had tears in their eyes. The little girl sat back against Ranger, her small hand never leaving his fur. For the first time since she entered the courtroom, she no longer looked like she wanted to run away. She looked like she had found her voice, and with Ranger beside her, she wasn't going to let fear silence her again. The two words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. "Bad man." The little girl's voice was tiny, trembling, but it echoed through the courtroom as though she had shouted it. The sound of chairs shifting, muffled gasps, and even a few sniffles rippled across the room. For a moment, it seemed no one breathed. The defendant stiffened in his chair, trying to mask his reaction, but his jaw clenched tight and his knuckles whitened on the table. The judge rapped his gavel lightly. "Order." His tone was firm, but even he couldn't disguise the softness in his eyes as he looked at the child. Miss Reynolds, the prosecutor, leaned forward just a little, keeping her voice low and warm. "Sweetheart, can you tell us who the bad man is?" The girl pressed herself against Ranger, burying her fingers in his thick fur. She didn't look at the defendant this time. She didn't have to. With Ranger beside her, her courage flickered back to life. Her small hand lifted shakily. She pointed, straight at the man seated at the defense table. Gasps filled the courtroom. Again, a juror covered her mouth with her hand. Another shook his head slowly, his eyes wet. The defense attorney sprang to his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor." "This is outrageous. A 3-year-old child pointing a finger? This is not testimony. It's emotional theater." But the judge didn't rule right away. Instead, he looked directly at the girl. His voice softened, losing the courtroom formality for a moment. "Young lady, are you sure? You don't have to be afraid here." The child nodded firmly. "Bad man?" she repeated, a little louder this time. Her tiny voice didn't waver. The judge leaned back, his lips pressed together. He gave the gavel a single sharp rap. "Objection overruled. The jury will give the statement the weight it deems appropriate." The defense attorney sat back down, though his face was red with frustration. He scribbled notes furiously, already preparing to tear apart this fragile testimony during cross-examination. Ms. Reynolds moved gently forward, careful not to push the child too far. "Sweetheart, you are very brave. Can you tell us, what did the bad man do?" The girl froze. Her lips trembled, her eyes darting toward the defendant again. For a heartbeat, it seemed like she would shut down entirely. Then Ranger moved. The big German shepherd leaned against her, pressing his head into her lap. His amber eyes locked with hers, calm and steady, as though urging her to go on. The little girl sniffled, wiped her eyes with her free hand, and whispered, "He hurt Mommy." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Miss Reynolds kept her voice steady. "Did Ranger help you then?" The girl's expression softened. She nodded and leaned her forehead against the dog's ear. "Safe," she whispered. Again, the jurors shifted in their seats, visibly moved. One of them dabbed at his eyes with a tissue. The story wasn't long or detailed, but it didn't need to be. The child's truth was cutting through every heart in the room. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Miss Reynolds, you have further questions at this time?" The prosecutor hesitated. She wanted to protect the girl's fragile bravery. "Not overwhelm her. No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Larkin, you may cross-examine." The defense attorney rose slowly, smoothing his suit jacket, his features composed. He forced a smile as he walked toward the little girl, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hello there," he said, crouching slightly, but not nearly as low as Miss Reynolds had done. "My name is Mr. Larkin. Can you say hi to me?" The girl pressed closer to Ranger and said nothing. He chuckled lightly, glancing at the jury as though to suggest she was too young to understand. "I just have a few questions, okay? You said bad man. Do you know what that means?" The little girl didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ranger's fur, her fingers twisting nervously. Mr. Larkin pressed on. "Do you know what a lie is?" The prosecutor shot to her feet. "Objection." Badgering a child witness. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Sustained." Mr. Larkin tread very carefully. The attorney raised his hands innocently. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to the child. "Sweetheart, are you sure someone didn't tell you to say those words?" At that, the girl finally looked up. Her eyes flashed not with fear, but with a surprising defiance. "No," she said, her small voice firm. Ranger's ears perked, his body alert but calm beside her. "No one told you?" Mr. Larkin asked. Pressing again, the girl shook her head vigorously. "Bad man?" "Me say," the jury murmured again, and this time the judge didn't call for silence. He let the moment linger, the child's declaration resonating through the room. Mr. Larkin frowned, realizing the danger. If he pushed too hard, he'd look cruel. But if he backed off, her words would stand unchallenged. He decided to retreat. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "The witness may step down." But the little girl didn't move. Instead, she turned and wrapped her tiny arms around Ranger's neck. The German shepherd accepted the embrace, sitting proud and tall, as though he understood the weight of what had just happened. The courtroom, normally a place of cold procedures and legal jargon, had just witnessed something raw and unforgettable. The judge finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "This court will recess for 15 minutes. As the gavel came down, people rose from their seats slowly, still dazed. Jurors wiped their eyes. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, sensing a headline that would reach far beyond this trial. Even the bailiff, a stern man rarely moved by emotion, cleared his throat and looked away as the mother rushed forward to hug her daughter. Through it all, Ranger remained steady. His job wasn't done yet. He stood between the little girl and the world, a wall of fur, loyalty, and quiet strength. The two words, simple, childlike, unpolished, had shifted the tide of the trial. Bad man. And though the legal battle was far from over, everyone in that room knew the case would never again be just about evidence and testimony. It was about the unshakable bond between a child and a dog, and the truth that bond had brought into the light. The silence that followed the child's words was unlike any silence the courtroom had ever known. Courtrooms are rarely quiet. They're filled with rustling papers, the creak of benches, whispered objections, the murmur of reporters. But now, as the 3-year-old's voice rang with its tiny yet piercing clarity, "Bad man," the entire chamber froze. It was as though every breath had been stolen from the room. The words themselves were simple, but the weight they carried was crushing. The judge leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he didn't move. His spectacles slipped slightly down. His nose and his fingers tightened around the polished wooden gavel. He had presided over countless cases, robberies, assaults, betrayals that shattered families, even murders. He had heard testimonies from men who cried, women who begged, experts who argued with charts and diagrams. Yet never had he heard something so raw, so innocent, and so utterly devastating as what had just left the lips of a child who could barely tie her shoes. Across the room, the defendant shifted uneasily. He tried to maintain his composure, his attorney whispering frantically at his side, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. For the first time since the trial began, his facade cracked. The jury noticed. The prosecution noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. The little girl, still clutching Ranger's fur, didn't fully comprehend the hurricane she had unleashed. To her, those two words weren't evidence. They were simply truth. She wasn't trying to sway a jury or make headlines. She was naming what she knew, what her heart recognized. Ranger's steady presence gave her courage, and she leaned her small head against his shoulder, as though the German shepherd alone could keep her safe from the chaos of adults. The defense attorney shot to his feet, voice sharp and defensive. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, desperate to shatter the spell that hung over the courtroom. "The child's statement is unreliable. She's too young to testify credibly." "This entire moment is—" "Sit down," the judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the objection like a blade. The attorney faltered, startled by the steel in the judge's tone. Everyone turned their eyes toward the bench. The judge had straightened now, glasses pushed firmly back into place. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, from the trembling child to the defendant, then to the jury. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, calmer, but it carried the gravity of years of wisdom and authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "you are here to weigh evidence. You are here to determine truth. Sometimes truth comes in long-winded testimonies, sometimes in expert analysis. And sometimes," he paused, letting the silence hold every ear, "it comes in two words from a child who has nothing to gain and everything to fear." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like frantic insects against paper. Cameras flashed discreetly from the press bench, capturing the solemn figure of the judge leaning forward. His lined face etched with gravity. The defendant's attorney leaped up again. "Your Honor?" "With all due respect, with all due respect," the judge interrupted firmly. "You will not diminish what we just witnessed. The court will assess the weight of this child's testimony in light of the full body of evidence. But I will not pretend I did not see what I saw, and neither will this jury." The words landed like thunder. The defendant's face paled. The jurors exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions shifting as if an invisible veil had been lifted. Even those who had wavered earlier in the trial could not ignore what had just unfolded. The mother of the child sat with trembling hands pressed against her mouth, tears streaking down her cheeks. She hadn't dared believe her daughter would be able to speak at all, let alone with such certainty. She knew better than anyone how much fear had stolen the little girl's voice in the weeks leading up to the trial. But now, with Ranger beside her child had spoken words that echoed louder than any adult testimony could. The judge exhaled heavily, as though carrying the weight of what had just occurred. His eyes lingered on the child once more. She sat quietly now, her tiny hand buried in Ranger's thick fur. The dog remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the man she had pointed to, steady, unyielding, protective. In that moment, it was as if Ranger, too, understood the gravity of what had transpired. The judge finally removed his glasses, setting them gently on the bench. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the emotion he usually kept guarded. "I have served as a judge for over 20 years, he began, "and I have always believed in the power of evidence, reason, and argument. Yet today I am reminded that justice is not only about laws and statutes. Sometimes it is about humanity. It is about innocence speaking against cruelty." His words drew the courtroom deeper into silence. Even the defense attorney, red-faced and frustrated, held his tongue, recognizing that no legal maneuver could undo the impression left on every soul in that room. The jury sat straighter, their expressions solemn. They were not only listening, they were feeling. They had been touched in a way evidence charts and witness reports never could. The judge then addressed the little girl directly, softening his tone. "You were very brave today," he told her gently. "You told us something very important, and this court thanks you." His voice cracked ever so slightly on the last word, but he pressed on, regaining composure. The girl nodded shyly, hugging Ranger's neck. To her, the judge's praise was nice, but she still found more comfort in the silent, loyal dog by her side. The gallery broke into quiet sobs. Even the bailiff discreetly wiped at his eyes. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a moment that revealed the fragile yet unshakable courage of innocence. For the rest of that day, the trial carried on, but the judge's reaction and the little girl's 2 words hung over everything like a shadow. Witness testimonies continued. Evidence was presented, arguments exchanged, but nothing could erase what the jury had witnessed. When the gavel finally struck to adjourn, the judge lingered on the bench longer than usual. He watched the little girl being led gently out of the courtroom, Ranger at her side. He wondered how many times in his career he had grown numb to crime, to evidence, to procedure. But today had shaken him. Today, he remembered why justice mattered. Not for statistics, not for records, but for children like her, for the innocent who relied on truth to be spoken and believed. That night, as he sat in his chambers, the judge replayed the moment again and again. The trembling hand pointing, the tiny voice saying, "Bad man," and the way the room seemed to stop breathing. He knew the jury would carry that moment into deliberations. He knew the case had shifted irreversibly. For the first time in years, he found himself wiping away tears in private. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a witness to courage. And he would never forget it. The jury room had been sealed for hours. The wooden clock on the courtroom wall ticked like a heartbeat, each second dragging on like an eternity. Everyone waited in hushed silence. The judge at his bench, the defense attorney pacing nervously, the prosecutor sitting stiff and still, and the audience leaning forward, hardly breathing. In the corner, Ranger, the K9, sat calmly, his golden brown eyes scanning the room. Beside him sat the little girl, her hand resting in his fur, her mother holding her close. It had been a long trial, grueling and emotionally charged. Evidence had been presented, witnesses had testified, and arguments had clashed. Yet in the end, the case hadn't been decided by clever words or dramatic speeches. It had been changed by 2 simple words, spoken by a child who had once been too afraid to speak at all. Bad man. Now, everyone was waiting to see if those words would echo inside the jury's deliberations. The bailiff suddenly appeared at the side door. His voice carried across the room. "The jury has reached a verdict." A collective breath swept through the gallery. People who had been slouched sat up straighter. Some clasped their hands together in prayer. Others crossed their arms tightly, as if bracing for impact. The defendant, who had seemed smug and unshaken throughout the trial, shifted uneasily in his seat. He glanced at the jury box as the 12 men and women filed back in, their expressions unreadable. The judge lifted his gavel slightly, but didn't strike it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice steady, "have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair and tired eyes, rose to her feet. She held the paper in trembling hands. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The entire courtroom leaned forward. The clerk approached, took the folded paper, and carried it to the judge. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the words before handing it back to the clerk. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of finality, the clerk read, "In the case of the People versus Daniel Hayes, on the charge of aggravated assault and endangerment of a minor, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps erupted through the courtroom. Some cried out in relief. Others wiped tears from their eyes. The defendant slammed his fists against the table, his lawyer grabbing his arm to keep him seated. His face turned red with fury, his lips curling back as though he might shout, but the gavel struck sharply. Order! The judge barked, his tone cutting through the chaos. The mother of the little girl broke into quiet sobs, clutching her daughter tightly against her chest. The child, still seated next to Ranger, lifted her head. She didn't fully understand the weight of what had just happened, but she saw the tension in her mother's shoulders ease, saw the tears of relief, and she smiled faintly. Her small fingers twisted into Ranger's fur, and the dog pressed closer, as if acknowledging victory in his own silent way. The judge turned his gaze toward the jury. His eyes softened, even though his posture remained stern. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, thank you for your service. You have fulfilled a great responsibility with care and diligence. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court. The foreperson nodded, tears glistening in her own eyes. She knew they had made the right decision. As the jurors filed out, the prosecutor leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, shaky breath. It had been one of the hardest cases of his career. Convicting someone who had terrified a child was never easy. He knew without the little girl's courage and without Ranger, the case might have gone very differently. Meanwhile, the defense attorney buried his face in his hands. He had fought hard, but deep down, even he knew the truth had been impossible to hide. The judge addressed the defendant directly. Daniel Hayes, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will follow in due course. Until then, you are remanded into custody. The bailiffs moved forward, snapping handcuffs around the man's wrists. He cursed under his breath, glaring toward the little girl as though she had personally destroyed him. But before his words could spill out, Ranger let out a low, threatening growl, his teeth flashing for just an instant. The defendant paled, and for the first time, he looked truly powerless. The little girl giggled softly, tugging at Ranger's ear. Good doggy, she whispered, the tension breaking into innocence once more. The gallery, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now seemed lighter. Strangers hugged. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks, already preparing headlines. The story of a child and a canine who had swayed justice would ripple far beyond the walls of this courthouse. The mother approached the bench with her daughter in her arms. Your Honor, she said softly, thank you for allowing her to speak, and for letting the dog stay with her. She couldn't have done it without him. The judge removed his glasses and looked at the little girl. No, he said gently. It was her bravery that made this possible. The dog only gave her the strength to show it. The girl tilted her head, confused, but then smiled brightly when Ranger nudged her hand. The bailiffs led the defendant away, his protests fading down the hallway. The sound of his voice was replaced with the hum of people talking, some still crying, others whispering about what they had just witnessed. When the courtroom began to empty, the prosecutor walked over to the mother. He crouched down to the little girl's level, his eyes kind. You were very brave today, he said. Do you know that? The child nodded solemnly. Ranger helped me. The prosecutor smiled. Yes, but you were the one who spoke the truth. Ranger barked once, as if agreeing, his tail wagging proudly. As they left the courthouse, the little girl held tightly to her teddy bear with one hand and Ranger's leash with the other. The spring sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, warming her face. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions flying. How did she do it? What gave her the courage? What's next for the family? The mother shielded her daughter, whispering, Let's go home. She didn't care about the noise, the headlines, or the cameras. What mattered was that justice had been Served. But still, those two words would remain unforgettable, etched into the memory of every person who had sat in that courtroom. Bad man. The truth, spoken through the innocence of a child and carried on the loyalty of a K-9, had prevailed. And in that victory, the courtroom had been given more than a verdict. It had been given hope. The courthouse had emptied, leaving only the echoes of footsteps on polished floors and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the brick walls golden, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees along the street. For most people, the trial was over, its headline-grabbing moments reduced to short news clips and newspaper articles. But for the little girl, her mother, and Ranger the K-9 who had been her guardian, the experience had left a mark far deeper than the public would ever fully understand. As they stepped onto the courthouse steps, the mother bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "You are so brave," she whispered. "So very brave." The child's small hand gripped Ranger's leash tightly, her thumb rubbing his fur. "Ranger helped," she said simply. Her mother nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know, baby. I know." The bond between them, the human and the dog, was something neither time nor circumstance could break. Ranger had not just been a companion. He had been a protector, a bridge between fear and courage. That day in court, his silent presence had allowed a voice long silenced by terror to finally speak, and in doing so, had shaped the course of justice. Back inside the courthouse, the judge remained in his chambers, reflecting on the trials. Unprecedented events. He had presided over hundreds of cases, yet few had affected him so profoundly. In all his years, he had witnessed testimony that swayed juries and seen evidence that proved guilt. But rarely had he seen innocence, courage, and truth collide in such a simple, undeniable form. He thought of the child, her trembling hand, and Ranger's steady gaze. Justice, he realized, was not only the application of law, it was the protection of those too small or too fragile to protect themselves. News of the trial spread quickly, carried by local television stations, newspapers, and social media. Headlines screamed, "Toddler's words and police dog change verdict." Two words that stunned a courtroom. People everywhere were captivated not by the drama of the case alone, but by the extraordinary courage of a 3-year-old girl and the loyalty of a K-9 who refused to leave her side. Within weeks, the little girl and Ranger became symbols of hope. Children wrote letters to her, thanking her for being brave. Animal lovers hailed Ranger as a hero. But the mother, ever humble, reminded them all that it wasn't about fame. It was about truth. Even the jurors, long after the trial concluded, spoke of that day. Many admitted they had cried, some more than once. They described the moment the girl pointed at the defendant, uttering those two words, and how Ranger had been a silent anchor, giving her the courage to speak. It wasn't just evidence, one juror later said. It was the truth shining through. And sometimes, the simplest truth carries the heaviest weight. For the child, life returned gradually to normal. There were therapy sessions to help her process the fear she had endured, playdates with friends who didn't understand exactly what she had survived, and quiet moments at home with her mother and Ranger. But every day, she carried the knowledge that her words had mattered, that her voice, when guided by trust and bravery, could change the world. Ranger, meanwhile, remained vigilant. Even in the calm of home, he would stay close, his ears perked at the slightest sound, his eyes scanning for potential threats. But he also learned to relax, allowing the little girl to crawl over his back during play, to whisper secrets into his fur, and to share moments of pure joy. The bond had grown deeper than anyone could have imagined in a courtroom that day. Months later, the trial's outcome inspired new programs in the community. Local law enforcement and child advocacy groups partnered to create initiatives ensuring that children in traumatic situations had supportive companions during legal proceedings. Ranger's role in the courtroom became a case study in the power of canine therapy, showing how an animal's presence could provide safety, courage, and clarity. For even the youngest witnesses, the judge, too, incorporated lessons from the trial into his work. He began advocating for child-friendly courtrooms and procedural accommodations that allowed vulnerable witnesses to speak without fear. He often recounted the story in seminars, emphasizing the moment he realized that bravery and truth sometimes transcend traditional courtroom evidence. For the little girl growing up, the memory of that day remained vivid. She learned to trust her instincts, to speak up when something was wrong, and to lean on the allies who stood by her. Ranger remained her constant, guiding her through fear, comforting her in uncertainty, and reminding her that courage often comes in small, quiet forms. Years later, when the child had grown, she would often recount the story of her courtroom experience. People were still captivated, not by the trial itself, but by the extraordinary connection between a child and a dog, a story of loyalty, bravery, and the transformative power of simple truth. And every time she told it, she would pause to look at Ranger, now older, but still ever watchful, and whisper, "We did it." In that moment, it wasn't just a story. It was a testament. A testament to courage that transcends age, to the innocence that speaks louder than fear, and to a bond that could not be broken by terror, intimidation, or evil. The legacy of that day endured far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The child's 2 words had reshaped lives. The defendant faced justice. The mother found relief, and the community learned that bravery doesn't always come from strength. It often comes from the smallest voice, accompanied by the most loyal heart. And Ranger, the silent hero of the courtroom, had proven what everyone who had ever loved a dog already knew: that loyalty, courage, and love could not only protect but inspire. And sometimes, those simple, steadfast qualities were all that were needed to change the world. Even in the quietest moments, years later, when the world seemed uncertain, the story of a little girl and her police dog reminded people everywhere that truth matters, courage matters. And sometimes, 2 words, spoken with fear, love, and trust, are enough to leave a lasting mark on the hearts of all who witness them.